Good evening, and welcome to another developer interview for our Perceptive podcast series here on Game Wisdom. As I always say, I'm always looking for new guests for this series, so if you're interested, be sure to reach out. I'll have a sign-up form listed down below as well, as I'm always happy to chat with developers about their games. My guest tonight is an indie dev who has worked on a kind of variety of smaller titles, and they reach out willing to come on and chat about whatever we can think of when it comes to game dev. So please welcome, from the YouTube channel as well as doing game development, Deltav. How are you doing?
Hello. I'm doing pretty all right. Yeah.
Thank you again for reaching out and wanting to come on and chat about your games.
Yeah, no problem.
Mm-hmm. So, since it's your first time on the cast, could you talk a little bit about kind of like your background when it comes to like getting into game dev?
Well, I mean, just in general, I mean, I'm a student at I'm not going to mention where, obviously, but I originally got into game development. I played this one game that I doubt you've heard of called Ironcast, made by some random guy. It was really good, and I thought I kind of always wanted to make like a clone of it because he kind of gave up on it after like not too long, which was I thought it was a real shame. So I tried doing stuff in like Scratch and all that, but it never really worked out until eventually I started taking classes at my school on game or like programming in general, and I kind of just decided to learn Unity on my own based off of some of the content from the classes, like a year and a half ago, I think, and yeah. And I mean, I've just been working on stuff ever since.
Okay. So, have you been actually making games for a year and a half, or have you been putting them out a little bit longer than that?
Uh, I mean, it depends. I mean, I've been making games for a while, but I've been using like actual game engines for only like a year and a half. You know what I
mean? Mm-hmm. And I'm not too familiar with Scratch. Which what does that engine do?
Well, it was really Snap, but it's like a clone of it. It's the block programming, if you know what I mean, where you have instead of like typing in lines of code, you just have sprites and you just like put blocks and drag them together and all that.
So it's kind of like something that with like something like Game Maker, like you just like go like the basic level of that.
I suppose it's like more basic than Game Maker. It's like where everyone starts, probably, or most people, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah, I do judge student projects from time to time. And I see that a lot of them do come from Scratch as kind of like a very basic start. With like the kind of games that you like to make, like, I guess like what is like your style? Like, which genres do you like to work in?
Honestly, I like working on really whatever kind of. I've made like a massive range of like, I mean, nearly every genre that I can really think of. I mean, I've made platformers, I've made like fighting games, kind of like RPGs. I guess not really. And then I've made shooters and all that. But usually they're 2D because I can't really do much in 3D. You know, I'm not very good at that.
Mm-hmm. And with like going from Scratch to then starting to learn and use of Unity, how has it been like starting out as a developer, like learning a new language / new engine?
Honestly, it was surprisingly quick. Like I watched some YouTube videos. I actually have on my itch my first ever project. It's just called Old Unnamed Project, but it surprisingly turned out not that bad for a first project because I made like it's basically like recoded from Snap or Scratch, same thing. Like I kind of just went through and just remade all the systems from that in Unity. And with learning Java at the same time, which is similar enough to C# that I kind of can translate between the two. It really helped out with getting used to coding because I didn't have to learn everything, like starting from nothing, you know.
With like design your games again, they're obviously going to be on the smaller side. Like, what's been kind of like the I guess timeline of like getting a game out there?
Most of these games are actually, I think nearly all of these are from game jams, except for actually, yeah, pretty much all of them are from game jams, of various amounts of time. Most of them are from the solo development game jams, but a couple of them are from some longer ones. I did the one of them was from the the Boss Rush Jam, and then it also was in the Radial Jam and a couple others. So yeah, usually just over the course of like a weekend, or on rare circumstances like a bit longer than that.
Okay. And are you working with a team now on any projects?
Right now,
Mm-hmm.
no. I mean, we're kind of just doing our own thing. I did work on a team with the Radial Jam and the Boss Rush Jam because they allowed those.
Mm-hmm.
And the team, I was the same team both times, and it was the same kind of style of game. Well, vaguely, but you know.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, we're not working on anything together because we have our own things to do until probably around the summer when everyone's free.
All right. And I guess like with the kind of games that you're like interested in making, like going forward, like these have all been kind of, as you said, like game jam projects, smaller stuff like that. Have you given any thought to like making like a fully released game, or a longer developed game?
I've I mean, I have tried that with one of these games called Carrington that I tried, but I tried it like twice. But both times I had to give up because it just got too difficult to work with, and I got burnt out.
Mm.
And I've been working on some of these other game jam games, improving them. I'm hoping to release some of them on Steam eventually, but no promises on that.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, with the topic of like burning out in games, though, that's definitely an interesting one we could spend a few minutes discussing. Because I've worked with like smaller teams, I've had a chance to watch a lot of developers like from the outside, and it's very easy, I think, to put too much on your plate when you're starting out as a developer. Like, what kind of led to the burnout? If you don't mind talking about it.
It was mostly just that I'm like I I've had a lot of trouble like planning for the future when I make like larger projects.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't make systems very modular, so I can't really. If I try to expand upon stuff, especially if I like spend a large amount of time taking a break, then it becomes just too problematic. And especially since I only started learning like just over a year ago. I'm not like super experienced as of now, so it's kind of just troublesome to stay with stuff, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's something that I've heard from like smaller developers from time to time. That challenge of, hey, it's great to work on a project. Maybe it will be only a weekend long, maybe 4 or 5 weeks. How do you scale it up to something that's going to be the next, I don't know, 1 to 3 years of your life? It can get very demanding.
Yeah, I don't know how people really focus on like the same thing for multiple years. I barely managed to stick to working on Carrington for like 2 months until I had to take my first break for Burnout, and then I got back to working on it for another month until I just gave up completely. And like the rest of these games, I mean, for the most part, if I want to like continue working on them, I don't put in the same amount of effort as I did when I started. I just like work on them on and off. You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's something I've seen from a lot of like larger, or I would say like maybe like larger indie developers, like especially when they start talking about like long-term projects that they may not work on full time. They may work on part time. They may take a break, and that can also often lead to, especially like over like the 2010s. I have spoke to developers who spend like 5 to 8 years on a project, not every day working on it, but they may work on for a little bit, they may take a few months off, they may come back to it, and it leads to a lot of these projects getting very demanding. And it's also one of the reasons why I talk to a lot of developers and say that getting a game from concept to release is a huge deal, no matter how big or small that game is.
Yeah, I mean, it's very. I couldn't imagine working on one game for 10 years, as you said. Like
Mm-hmm.
the amount of things that can change.
Yep.
Like just if you stick with one thing, to me at least, if things change too much, I would probably just not. I would probably just drop the project eventually. I mean, maybe with sunk costs, Like it's a sunk cost at some point after probably 5 years, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But still,
Yeah. And like the amount of time they go into that, it again starts to really add up for projects. And with like how long it takes, like as I said a minute ago, if we were talking 10 years ago in terms of game dev, a lot of the indie developers I spoke to either like first timers or those with like a little bit of a background trying to make their like first retail game, they would be like, yeah, I'll spend 8 years working on a single game. I don't care. That's my dream game. That's one that I want to make. And like for like long time listeners watching or listening to this podcast right now, I did like so many of the developers I interviewed from like 2012 to maybe like 2018, 2019 had that very mindset that it didn't matter how long it took. We would just get that one game out and that would be it. But like around like 2020 and I think going forward, a lot more developers I've spoken with these days tend to prefer making like smaller projects. That I don't want to make an 8-year long game. I'd rather make, 5 or 6 smaller games and, just build myself up like that.
yeah. I mean, they say quantity is better or quality is better than quantity, but if it takes 8 years to get quality, at that point it might not be worth it, you know?
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, and this is something I think is a very bitter pill for developers to swallow, most of the times it's not worth it. Like, you can get an amazing game that's out there, but the chance of that game recouping all the time and, of course, money you sunk into it is very low. And people will, of course, try and cite the super big successful examples. Stuff like A Darkest Dungeon, A Slay the Spire, pick any, like, indie darling over the past 7 to 8 years. But they are more often than not the exception to the rule. And when I've interviewed a lot of, like, student developers these days especially, they are very much, I think, more grounded in their game dev like thoughts than again when I spoke to people like 10 years ago.
I suppose it's because maybe because game dev is getting more popular, and maybe just people are realizing nowadays just how many try to work on stuff for such a long time and yet never like get anywhere, unfortunately.
Yeah. Or the other idea is they'll just keep going around the circle of I want to make this, oh wait, I can make this, but let me just keep trying again and again and again. And sometimes it just leads to this like endless development. And that has, I think, been like the nail in the coffin for a lot of first-time developers over the years.
Yeah, I had that same problem when I first started. I actually did want to, like, despite how I have been speaking now, I actually did want to like work on a project for a long time, like a longer term project, maybe a year or two. Which was how I started with Carrington, and then I gave up twice. I mean, I told you this, but I gave up like two times. And they were like completely. I had to like completely redesign the game from scratch both times, because, as you said, that like endless development, I suppose, Yeah.
And again, it's one of those things I think for like with this audience that's listening to us right now, I know I have a very healthy mix of developers with very different backgrounds. There are people who have been making games for years, sometimes even decades at this point. And then there's a lot of people who just start, maybe in the last 3 to 5 years. And I think what you said a minute ago about how game dev has become more accessible, more popular over the last decade has been a very like big element of this. That when we talk about kind of getting into game dev again 15 years ago, it was very much do whatever the heck you want. Like, who cares how long it takes? Who cares how much money? You're an indie developer. There aren't too many of them out there. And again, it's funny to say that now, but that was pretty much how things were like 15, 20 years ago. If you could get a game out the door, no matter how long it took, no matter how much money, you weren't really competing with anyone else because there really wasn't any market established. But when we fast forward to today, there's 30 to 50 games coming out daily. And it's becoming a lot harder, I think, for people to understand. And I think to that point about quantity over quality, that a highly quality game that is going to recoup that cost, that's not going to take, years of your life, is a lot harder to design than you might think.
Yeah. And I feel like maybe another problem with that is that if you do get through all that time and effort making that quality game, it might just get buried in the huge onslaught of everybody else,
Oh.
So if you just make multiple games, maybe one of them might get out into the market and you may be able to continue working on that if you have, an vague established community,
Mm-hmm. And it's also, again, I think why like the strategy for a lot of indie devs have shifted. That again, this idea of going like all or nothing into a single project really doesn't, I think, bear fruit anymore. And it was something that I was just talking to some people about this past week at the time I was recording. I was saying that if you're getting like your first big game out the door, it's getting ready to go on Steam or itch or whatever, if you want people to know about that, you gotta market it. Like, you actually have to, set up a social media channel. You have to start telling people about this game. Because, as you just said, like, it doesn't matter if you've made the greatest game of all time if no one plays it. And, again, that happens so much. I have covered games from developers that have had, like, less than 10 reviews on Steam. And I can enjoy it. I can, shout their praises out. But that game, I can almost guarantee, it's not going to be earning an income for them.
Yeah. Never mind. I forgot what I was going to say.
That's alright. And I guess to go back a little bit more about like burning out over the project, you were saying that it was like kind of becoming like too big, or it was like too much like to go into it. And I was wondering if you could just kind of elaborate on that a little bit, because I know I have a lot of student and first-time developers listening. I just would kind of like wanted them to kind of hear, like, when did it like start to feel like too demanding for you?
I feel like it started feeling like that after because I had to take a break from it for like 2 months. Partially because I was working on a game jam, and I decided to continue break, and then started working on the Boss Rush jam, which took up another month.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, I decided I want to get back into working on this. And then when I come back and I look at the awful code, like it was terrible, and it wasn't modular at all. And I tried to, and like every time I tried to add a feature, everything would break because there was so much that needed to happen in order to add one tiny little thing, So at that point, it just became like too stressful to like continue trying to make it, like continue iterating on it. Like the progress was just too slow. And I'm not very good with slow progress, like slow and steady. Mm-hmm. Like it's not, I just feel like I'm not making any progress at that point, at least for me. So,
yeah, and I think this is also where I see this like mentality from a lot of developers to constantly be shifting projects. That, okay, Project A is starting to get a little bit annoying, I'm going to start to do Project B. Project B is slowing down, let me think about a Project C, and then Project D, E, F, and so on. And again, it leads to this, like, it sounds great at the start, but then of course what ends up happening is now you have 7 projects, all at varying different stages of development, and not one of them is like being pushed through.
Yeah, that's a problem I have been also dealing with, because like I mean, as I said, I'm like switching between like 2 different projects, like one after another. I mean, I've been sticking pretty okay with not making too many new projects that are like seen at all. But I've just been switching between a bunch of projects, like going randomly between them, quite a lot. I've been going between like the a platformer of mine, and then like every couple weeks I just get bored of it, and then I go back to a different game, and then I go back and forth forever until one of them makes a little bit of a breakthrough, you know?
Yep. And like I said, I've talked to developers who have that same kind of issue where the second the idea stalls for any reason whatsoever, I don't want to work on the same. Like I don't, my heart's not in it. Let me think of something else. And then they go to something else, and something happens, and well, I don't want to work on this one anymore, so let me go work on something else. And it's why I said a few minutes ago, and this is for everyone listening to us, getting a game from start to finish, even if it is just like a simple game jam, something that you're just going to put up on an itch page and will never sell, put a price tag on, it's still a huge deal. And it's why it's such a very, I think, hard first step for a lot of developers when they're starting out.
Yeah, that's why I like doing game jams so much instead of just working on projects out of the blue, because they kind of force me to work on a specific project instead of switching on and off between them or like taking a break and all that. I actually have incentive to stick to one thing for maybe an extended amount of time or maybe just a couple days, but it's something, you know?
And it's also where kind of like the challenge of the game production side really comes in. Again, as you said, like with Game Jam, you don't need to worry about long-term development or long-term planning. If your Game Jam is 40 hours or a week, that's it. Like, there's nothing else more to it. And I think it's also why we see a lot of interesting ideas come from the Game Jam side. One, because of the short time frame, and two, because I do feel like there's like this different mentality on working on something that's already finished versus, again, like just starting completely bare bones, back at zero, complete from scratch, and having to build something.
Yeah, I feel like another thing that adds to like how game jams are good at making progress is that you're like forced to make a prototype in only 3 days. So you have to cut out all the fat, all the random stuff that you don't really need, but like you'd want, so that you can focus on just making something in those however long you have, you know? Instead of focusing on like, oh yeah, I want this huge scope. I want this and this and this and all these massive, very complicated mechanics that are gonna take forever to make. And instead you're just like, I just want this very specific general idea to work. And then people can give me feedback and all that, and I can improve from there instead of just going along and making a mistake and not noticing it for who even knows how long.
And it also is why, like from a game jam perspective, that if you do have like this like very like weird idea or something that you don't think it's really going to bear fruit, it's not going to really scale over like a 18 months to like 3 year dev cycle, you can mess with it for a weekend or a week. And as you said, like the idea of like trimming the fat is a really great way to kind of like force this idea out there. Because as for people listening to us know, we've seen some amazing concepts come from game jams over the years. Games like Super Hot, what was it? Forager being another good example. And
Mindustry?
What was that?
Mindustry is a good example too.
Mindustry was a game jam. I didn't know that one. But yeah, I did play that one. And yeah, it's a great way to see if this idea is worth exploring. Because that's the other side of things. The longer a game takes, and this goes with what you said earlier about how much time and how much things can change. That's another trap I saw a lot of developers in the 2010s fall into. That I'll work on this game when no one's making the genre, no one's doing anything like this. If it takes 5 to 10 years to get that game out, there's a good chance someone else had an idea or a similar idea, and their game is already done and out the door.
Yeah, at that point, like it's kind of like I guess it's kind of like a space race per se, you know? Like you have like this big aspiration, but if you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be the first to do this, but you can't just assume you'll be the first to do this because somebody else might manage to do it first, you know?
Yeah. And if the whole selling point of your game is just, my game is just something that no one has done before and there's nothing else to it, you just lost the entire, marketing for your game at that point.
Yeah.
And it's also why I think we've really have seen development has shifted to making more short form games. That, yes, it's great if you can make this massive, 40 to 80 hour long experience. It took 6 to 10 years of your life. It's a fantastic game. But again, if it bankrupted you in the process, are you going to be able to make a game number 2 or a game number 3 at that point? More than likely, no. And for a lot of what we've seen, game dev has evolved over the last 5 to 7 years again, has been developers saying, yeah, I'm fine making a game that only took 3 months, maybe a year. Because even if it earned me, very little, it's enough to let me make another game, and another one. And I feel like there is a topic to be greater explore for a variety, or talking to a lot of developers, about understanding what makes a game successful, or is a game successful. Because a lot of people, I feel, don't quite get that. That they'll see a game come out, they'll see, hundreds or even thousands of people buy it, and then that studio closes 2 to 3 months later, and no one really thinks about why that happened. They just see, okay, game is out on Steam, it has all these reviews, so it must have been amazingly successful. But something that I've been studying a lot more the last 5 years has been trying to figure out whether or not a game really did help or hurt a studio. So, what I want to ask you regarding that, as someone who is starting, who's still making smaller games, as we've been talking over the last few minutes about burnout and when things get too big or too unmanageable for you, what do you think about in terms, when do you think you would like to try a larger game, or any lessons that you've learned that you want to avoid when it comes time to really make something bigger?
Well, for the most part, I doubt I'm gonna be working on a big project for at least the next year, maybe.
Mhm.
I have some maybe medium-sized projects that I want to try, but most of those are, I just want to expand on stuff from previous games that I've already made. Most of them are not, I'm going to start from scratch. I want to completely make this new thing, I'm and sort of lessons. I just want to, I guess, focus on instead of setting up stuff just so that it works, which usually you would want to do, but in the long run, it's not very sustainable per se. So it should be, at least if you're planning on working on a very long-term project, you should make sure to set it up so that it's modular, as I said before. You need to make sure that when you want to integrate new stuff, or I guess, what's it called, just go I don't remember the word for it, but if you want to just add new things, it should not take forever to do that. It should be able to just be just a couple lines of code, and then you add in your new feature, and it just slots right in, preferably in an ideal world. That's what it would be So you should strive more towards that instead of just, I just want this to work. Which, it's good, that's a good mindset for a game jam, just I want things to work. But for a long-term game, it's not a game jam,
Yep. And it's also when things really get compounded as a developer. Because there's also, as we said, that tendency to just keep adding more. That if I keep putting more into this project, it will bear even more fruit. It will become even more successful. But again, I think with how much the market has changed over the years, that if you can put out a overwhelmingly fantastic game that's maybe only 2-3 hours long, that is far more preferable to this kind of sprawl of a 50+ hour game. And I think, again, it really goes to how much the market has changed over the past 10 years.
Yeah, especially if your game is very complicated. If you want to teach your players new stuff, you shouldn't, unless you have a preset community of people who are like, I love this game and I'll teach it to people, I'll make YouTube tutorials, etc. Like, unless you have a community like that, or you're willing to try to build that yourself, you need to make sure that your game, like, it doesn't have like a 10-hour tutorial teaching players every tiny minuscule mechanic, and instead you should be more focused on just like more general, like, easy to learn stuff, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's also, again, like part of that challenge of learning game design on top of actually making a game. Again, like, you're, like, for you and for people listening, like, you're talking to someone who has covered so many games for the past 13 years. I have seen everything from student projects to fully developed games. And the actual design side is its own, nightmare to understand. Because I have played games that have had zero onboarding. I've played some of the most, like, confusing and awkward games to try and learn. And there may be a market for that. But as like with everything we've talked about in terms of this, like, all-encompassing idea of releasing a game, if your game doesn't present itself well, and presentation for a first-time developer is often one of the hardest things to do right, people aren't going to be interested in that. And if they're not interested in that, they're not going to be checking out anything else that you're going to be doing in the future.
Yeah, that's a pretty big issue, because a lot of the time you're not going to have people like going through and then looking at your game and being like, I'm going to play this all the way through just to see, like, I want to see every minuscule detail of this, and this is going to be, I'm sure this is going to be a great game, and if it is, I'm going to go play everything that this developer has. Most people are going to be like, oh yeah, let's just check this little thing out, and then if it's good, like, if what they check out is good, they'll keep going, you know? They're not just going to play through despite how they may feel at the beginning, unless, of course, they've seen, like, maybe a playthrough or, like, reviews, but in order to get reviews, you need to have the people that have played through the game in the first place, you know?
Mm-hmm. And getting that is incredibly difficult, especially for any first-time developer. Because as another thing that I've heard from, like, smaller teams and first time is how much of a, like, pulling teeth it can be to get someone to play your game and get honest feedback from them.
Yeah, I remember a quote. I don't remember who it's from, but they said, like, this is for, like, YouTube, but it should apply to, like, everything in general. Your first 100 subscribers are the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this applies to games too. Like, your first 100 reviews or downloads or plays or whatever, they're going to be the hardest to get, because after that, people are starting to going to be, like, paying attention to those reviews, and then they're going to start playing, and it's going to keep spiraling, and maybe eventually you'll get, like, enough, you'll get enough to where it's self-sustaining. You don't need to put any more effort into that, into, like, marketing.
And getting people to check a game out is very difficult in that respect. And it also leads to, like, that kind of issue when your game kind of breaks containment, when it starts getting more and more eyes on it. And I've seen, like, this mentality from a lot of developers on social media, where once a game gets popular, or it gets enough that people are talking about outside their fandom, consumers become very critical of those games. Like, if you're just playing a game that you just found on Steam or an itch, like, you weren't following this guy for, like, the last 5 to 10 years, and the game is bad or there's issues and you point that out, there are developers who don't like that, or they're not good at kind of taking that level of feedback. And while there's nothing wrong with, like, ignoring, like, the trolls or people flaming your game, if people are saying that your game is hard to play or it's confusing and you don't take those lessons to heart, that will always come back to bite you with future projects.
I feel like that lesson was kind of learned with the whole thing with what's that guy's name? The Yandere Simulator guy. I feel like that was, like, the biggest thing with that. Like, if I recall correctly, I don't know much about him, but I've seen that he didn't really pay attention to any feedback that was given for the most part. And I feel like that's a pretty big issue. Like, if you're just like, oh yeah, I've got this locked in plan for how I want this to go, and if people don't like this, then too bad, womp womp. Like, if you don't pay attention to what people like, then at some point, of course, people won't like your game if you don't pay attention to what they like. That's just how it is.
Mhm.
And you might like how your game is going, but if other people don't like how your game is going, and it's like a large majority of the player base, then what are you doing? Like, yeah, of course, it's you should do things that you enjoy, but if what you enjoy is a tiny minority of what everyone else cares about, you're not going to get anything.
Mhm.
You're just developing for yourself at that point.
And if you're working on like a personal project or just like trying to make something like weird and get out the door, there's nothing wrong with making a game that's specifically for you. And I've said this plenty of times for these podcasts and a lot of my design videos that if you're working on something that you have no intention of selling, that you are not basing your livelihood on the success or failure of a game, then yeah, do whatever the heck you want. Don't listen to people in that respect. But the moment that you're thinking, I'm trying to build a business, I'm trying to build something that I can, earn money or a livelihood off of, now you have to start thinking about this kind of stuff. And it's a very, I think, hard leap for some developers that, yes, it's great that you like this game, but if everyone you're showing your game to is just confused by and they don't know what you're doing, that should be, raising some alarm bells.
Yeah, I have vaguely similar problems as well. I mean, it's not with the gameplay. Usually, most of the time when I show people like the gameplay, I mean, of course, they have like normal, reasonable opinions about it. They're like, okay, I kind of like this. Here's some feedback or whatever. But a lot of people like don't really like how I do VFX. I usually, because I don't really notice when VFX are super strong. But a lot of people seem to get distracted by it. And I feel like I kind of just have trouble like putting that in because I don't really notice when I do too much, stuff like that. So if I were to make like a big game and I did that, that would be a big turnoff for people. People would not play it, people would be turned away.
Yep. And if you don't make those improvements when you're making a larger game, you're going to be left wondering, well, why is no one playing my game? I enjoyed it, or I don't see an issue with it. But again, the second you're putting your game out on a store page and you're intending to sell it, it's going to be under all the scrutiny, whether it is a 99-cent game or a 50, 60, or even now $80 game. And with kind of thinking about like your different projects and the different games you want to make, another thing that I kind of said a few minutes ago was about that challenge of what you want to make versus what you can actually make. And as we said at the start, you went from working in Scratch to learning Unity. And another thing that I've seen, I know everyone has struggled with, is when you have that freedom to do whatever you want. When I speak to developers who use kind of like custom or very specific engines, stuff like, what was it, Adventure Game Studio, Z Doom, like engines that they are very much hard coded in terms of like what they're meant for. You're not going to make a first person shooter out of Adventure Game Studio. It's never going to work like that. It does free you in terms of what you can make. But when you're working with something like a Unity, like an Unreal, and so on, you now have literally anything. You can make whatever you want. And it's that monkey's paw wish that I think has stymied a lot of developers. So I wanted to get like your thoughts on that as someone who's like starting out. Like as you're learning Unity with this idea of, yes, I can make whatever I want. What does that mean for you?
For me in particular,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wanted to, I guess, just like get like feelers on like what I can do. Which I mean, I figured out kind of my niche. I don't really like doing 3D stuff. 3D stuff is like too complicated for me. Although maybe like semi 3D stuff, I did that with some of my games where I did like partial 3D, and that was really fun. But it's just like the amount of like options that you gain from putting stuff in 3D makes like doing like a lot of stuff a lot more difficult than if it were just 2D, because then you have to worry about a whole other dimension worth of stuff basically. And I feel like in like a more generalized way that applies to like a lot of new developers. Like they have like when they're moving from stuff like Scratch and all that, or even from nothing to Unity, they get this whole new like world of opportunities, and then they think, oh yeah, I could add all these new features, but like they never really learned how to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
They just saw that they can do them and just tried, which isn't, it's like a nice thing to have them try better than nothing, but usually if you don't really know what you're doing, you're going to get, burnt out if you try to do stuff that you're not quite good at. Of course, it's good to practice, and maybe you do like it, and then you could stick with that as your like niche. But it's just like eventually, and like for beginners, I'm kind of ranting here a little bit, but for beginners, it's a problem like that because instead of having like knowing what they're good at, they do whatever, and there's too much scope creep. Their scope gets like too massive because they have all these random things that they don't really need, but they want because they can.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And they just keep on adding more and more, thinking that, yes, this is going to make my game bigger and better. Or they just try, fit like 5-10 different ideas into a single project. And again, if you're just experimenting to see how something works, or, figure out how this can be used in another game, there's no problem with that. But again, as we said earlier with the notion of Burnout, if you're trying to make all this work at the same time you're building a game that's going to take, starting 1 to 3 years and just keeps getting more and more and more, it's eventually just going to turn into this like giant blob of a mess. And how are you going to finish that? And again, like that one simple question has been the downfall of so many developers.
Yeah, a lot of the time you just don't finish that.
Yep.
You kind of eventually just give up. And if you do finish that, as I said, with the it's too complicated to learn because there's all these random features that don't really work together, but they like kind of do in your own way. Like the developer knew how they work together, obviously, because the developer, especially at the beginning of the game, like development cycle, the developer is the best in the world at their game. So they don't really have a problem with knowing how these features all work together. But for a new player, seeing all these random things that this developer added, it can be overwhelming, And that'll also cause the developer to not gain any traction.
And it's also why, for a lot of people, that they struggle to see why so-and-so did better. Why did this game work so well? If I made a game similar to it, why isn't my game getting hundreds of reviews or thousands of reviews? And as a really good example of this, we can look at, again, any successful breakout game over the last 7 years. Again, for a long time, people listening, I'm going to do my little cycle here, but I've been here to see Blueprints blow up, Balatro, Slay the Spire, FTL, Darkest Dungeon, Animal Well, of course, the whole Vampire Survivor Bullet Heaven trend. And the second a game comes out that does like that level of success, a lot of people immediately rush to try and capitalize on it. But what often happens is that you're not really creating a sustainable market because people resonate with that one game. That doesn't mean they're going to want to play 15, 30, 100 different copies of it for the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I feel it's like the trend of the time, It switches very often. So if you want to make a long-term like version of that kind of game, it might not work out because it's so oversaturated from the sudden explosion of random other indie developers that look identical to your game but may or may not be random worse quality, because they were just made all of a sudden just to get something out there that people might like because they like this other game that got really popular,
Yeah. And then from the kind of the other end of the spectrum of that, you'll have someone say, well, if this was like the super simple, very easy, or quote unquote easy game to make, I'm going to spend 5 years to make the ultra huge mega example in Unreal. I'm going to use, 4K super high res graphics. I will spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars to make something that maybe someone spent, less than 100K to make. And then they're going to be sitting there going, well, why is someone buying the super big example of it? Because, well, did anyone really want to play your ultra 4K? You need a 64 gigabytes of RAM or 64 gigabytes of memory just to be able to run this game? Probably not.
Yeah, and I mean, as I said, it kind of works out because you're too late.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even since you got it out, you weren't even with the trend if you did all that effort, which is kind of a shame. Because some games kind of like that are pretty good, but if you're too late or you get buried, then there's like no point. And plus, like as you said, like no people might like that game for a reason that's like not on like the surface. Like maybe it's like a deeper reason that they like that game other than just I just like the gameplay, in general. Just like the idea of it. People might just like that game in particular. And so just copying it might not get you the results you expected, Yeah.
Especially if you don't understand why people like that game to begin with. And again, like to go with the Bullet Heaven example, I played so many like first time and smaller Bullet Heaven games that were just like the complete opposite of Vampire Survivors. They were very slow to play, very awkward to play. And to what you just said about someone being a fan of a game or that specific game versus being a fan of a genre, that is another thing that I've seen so many times in the past, where, like with the MMO genre of the mid-2000s, that people were going, well, I'll just copy World of Warcraft, or I'll copy EverQuest, and yeah, maybe only 20% of the people, 10% of the people will play that, but that should be enough. And more than often, it's not, because if someone really loves Game A, they're not going to look for, the diet version of Game A. They're just going to stick with Game A.
Yeah. The only situation where that might not really be the case is if it's like abandonware. Mm-hmm. If the developer like abandoned the game and people like they love the game, of course, but the trend is already passed and nobody's made a game that is like as good as it and they want more, that actually might be a reason to go into that. But that's like a very rare circumstance, Yeah. Although, unfortunately, it's getting a lot more common nowadays with the amount of games that are just being abandoned by studios.
Yep. And, like, I think a similar example of that would be the deck building genre. That, for people who, like, their first deck building roguelike would have been something like a Slay the Spire, there were deck builders being released for many years in the 2010s. But, excuse me, not sorry about that. But not one of those games was reaching kind of the public zeitgeist. The other major example of this would be something like Battle Royale. That again, many people know Battle Royale from either PUBG or Fortnite, but there were other games being released at that time. It was King of the Hill, H1Z1. I know there's a few other ones like that, but not one kind of hit it big. And I think, again, it's why we see developers kind of chase these genre trends, because they want to be the one to hit it big. But if you already have that first success, your game is never going to capitalize on it. Right now, as we're recording this in the middle of May, I know we're going to get probably another 10 to 15 Balatro likes before the end of this year. And I can guarantee you that not one of them is going to have anywhere near the same level of success as Balatro.
Yeah, well, because Balatro happened to get really lucky. I mean, there are a couple kind of similar Balatro rights. There's that one, like, Degenerate Gamblers one that's like Blackjack. But that's they added their own spin on it, you know? They added, like, another reason to play it. Like, it's kind of similar to Balatro, although I think Balatro was after it. But I don't remember. But either way, they have their own reason to get it other than that it's just similar to Balatro. And plus, Balatro is still supported, you know?
Yep.
So if you want to capitalize it, you're going to have to be significantly better than Balatro by like a massive amount to get any traction. Because Balatro, the people who like Balatro, they're not going to be like, I want more, because they have what they want. And especially since it's moddable.
Oh, yes.
So, yeah.
And to your point about the game being supported, that's the other thing you have to keep in mind, that if you're trying to compete with something like Vampire Survivors, as an example, they're still putting out DLCs for it. They just released a mega one last year. So, how is your game going to compete with something that has, 4 or 5 plus years of development and DLC and expansions coming out?
Yeah, that's a pretty big problem. And I feel like a lot of the time, when big teams, like, they think, like, oh yeah, there's this one guy that did all that in this amount of time, so I feel like, oh yeah, this one guy did all this, made this big game, and maybe, like, 5 years, and it got really popular. So if we have 50 people working on it, we can make just as good as a game in, like, just a couple months, and then capitalize on it. Well, that never really works out as they would expect, because despite because the first game doesn't feel like it was made as, like, I guess, an allusion to another game, or like it doesn't feel very like corporate or like mass produced, you know? Because it feels like they handcrafted it.
And yeah, like, that's what we kind of saw with people talking about Baldur's Gate 3. Now, obviously, Larian is not a super small-time developer, but there's that idea that, okay, if a 10-person, a 20-person team could make X in 5 years, 8 years, whatever, if I take 100 people and give them even more money, they can make something even better in, half the time, a quarter of the time, whatever. But the thing that we've learned, I think, time and time again, or hoping that people will learn, is that developers are not interchangeable at that level. One of the reasons why Baldur's Gate 3 worked so well was that, well, that entire team, ate, slept, and breathed CRPGs for however long it took them to finish Baldur's Gate 3. And it's why, for a lot of smaller developers, when we see, like, these successes, like a Stardew Valley, like a Balatro, that these developers know these genres. They know them inside and out. So they can create that very interesting game that's something that resonates with them. If you're then trying to just, like, copy someone else's notes, you're not really, I think, grasping why they made this game this way.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just kind of like plagiarism at that point. If you just, like, copy someone, I feel like this is, like, it could be like an allusion to, like, AI, but I don't really want to drag that in here. But, like, how it, like, takes from all these other people and then it combines it into its own, like, mix. But it's not, like, handcrafted, like, manually, like, I decided why to put these things where. It's like, generated. So people don't really think, like, most people don't really think of how, like, this is beautiful. I wonder why they did it this way, and these all work together in this perfect way. It's more of just, like, it just did it in the way that everyone else did it.
Yep. And not understanding why a decision was made can often, again, lead to these games just not working. Like, with the Bullet Heaven example, as I said, I've played plenty of Bullet Heaven games that feel slow and horrible to play. Guess what didn't feel slow and horrible to play? Vampire Survivors. And I guess, like, here's another question for you as someone who's, like, starting out with game dev and kind of, again, dealing with this issue of burnout. There are a lot of developers who, when they see insert genre here, their first thought is, I'm going to make a better version of that. If it's a platformer, I'm going to make, a 15 times more complicated, more involved take of Mario. If it's a deck builder, the same thing. A first-person shooter, whatever. And while that can be certainly commendable if you can get it to work, more often than not, that is a recipe for failure. To just try and take something and go even more and beyond with it. And with like trying to think of like your games like that, what has been kind of like your thoughts as to what can I make versus what I want to make in that respect?
I feel like I kind of had that issue too at the beginning of my learning development, because as I
Mhm.
said, I played that game Ironcast and I really loved it, and I wanted to make like a, as you said, I want to make a significantly more complicated clone of it with 10 times the content and super
Mhm.
fancy. But I very quickly realized that I can't really do that because I don't have the experience. And then when I tried again a couple months ago, I still didn't really have the experience, but I added my like own stuff to it more or less, and I tried to cut down on some of the scope. But you can't just be you can't assume that you can do what these other people did, because they probably had a very good reason for having to do things the way they did, you know? Like if they spent a year and they had like a small team uh and all that, and like the game seems simple, there's probably a very good reason that
Mhm.
they spent a whole year making such a simple game, because it probably has a lot of stuff going on that you're just not really paying attention to. That just there that you subconsciously notice, you know?
Oh yes. And again, for people listening, when we say simple, more than often, getting a game to be that simple took a long time to make it work like that. And it's again why it's very hard to study genres if you only play like the really best, or the 10 out of 10 examples of them, because you're not seeing those traps. You're not understanding why, someone made, combat this way. You just see, well, combat's like this, so I'm just going to make my combat system exactly like it. Well, good luck with that.
Yeah, I feel like that's a problem, because especially when they're like, "Oh yeah, if I were to make this combat system, I would change this thing about it." But there's probably, I mean, there may or may not be, but there's probably a good reason that they made the combat system the way they did, and they're not doing it the way you want it to have been done. Because
Mhm.
the way you want it to have been done is probably nearly impossible to actually balance. It's probably impossible to iterate on. Maybe they even tried to do it the way you wanted to, but they had to cut it to make it more reasonable. You know?
Yeah. And if you change that combat system, or you change any system, you could end with a completely different game. So, like as a good example, or one of the examples would be something like the rise of all these Stardew Valley clones. There are Stardew Valley games that are like, what? Will we make the farming more involved? Will we make the combat more involved? What do we make the relationships more involved? And yes, you can build a game off of any one of those pillars. But if you're taking away from the other two aspects of Stardew Valley, you don't have a Stardew Valley game anymore. And if you're trying to market your game, Stardew Valley adjacent or Stardew Valley like, people are going to notice, well, I want to play a game like this, but I still want, this and this. And if your game doesn't have those, well, I'm not interested in it anymore.
Yeah. This reminds me. I don't. I didn't really. I saw this thing. It was like how like these cozy farming games work, but like the amount of like quote unquote cozy farming games that are just farming, like they don't understand why they're cozy, or whatever. Like they didn't understand how, like, yeah, it's like farming is like a thing, but it's not like the main thing. There's a lot of other smaller stuff that kind of conglomerates to make it so much more than just some like farming game. I mean, maybe you like that, but most people, like, the reason why the game is designed that way is not just around this one specific feature, because usually there's a lot more stuff, you know?
Yeah. And if you just think to yourself, well, I want to make a farming, first person shooting, spaceship dating sim, and all the Stardew Valley fans are going to jump on that game, they're not. Because the more you add, or the more genres you add to a specific design, you're creating a more niche experience. And if you fail to grasp that, you're going to end up with this game that, yes, maybe there's, I don't know, 200 people in the world who love this idea. They will support this game from day in and day out. But if you're thinking that I'm going to get at least 10,000 copies sold or 100,000 copies sold, you're going to be in for a very rude awakening.
Yeah, and plus, like what you said, like how like the spaceship shooter Stardew Valley clone, like it might seem on the like the surface level kind of like Stardew Valley, but it's not really because you got spaceships. There's spaceships in Stardew Valley. They probably don't even care about spaceships, and like there's shooting. Like it's not a combat like in the Stardew Valley. People aren't playing Stardew Valley to kill things, to be violent. I mean, there's like that mines thing. I don't really know much. I haven't really played Stardew Valley, but like they don't play Stardew Valley because of the combat. It's like just like a minor thing. They're not going there to mow down hordes of enemies.
Yeah, and again, like there's a lot to kind of discuss when it comes to the challenges and the burnout of game dev. But we are approaching our time for today, and yeah, if you're free in the future and you want to chat more about any of the game dev side of things, definitely reach out to me. I'll always be happy to have you back on.
Yeah, I will be having a lot of free time in the future, so perhaps I could.
Yeah. So one final point for our cast today, and then we'll wrap things up, because this goes with something that you said earlier, something that I thought a lot about, and that is making the person care about your game. As we spent the last few minutes talking about people, copying other games, copying other designs, or even just trying to put like a small spin on them. Ultimately, at the end of the day, and this is something that I was talking to some people I was doing consulting work with, you have to answer one question. Why should someone care about your game? What is the reason to play that game? And as we've said, a lot of people will just say, well, my game's just like a Stardew, my game's just like a Balatro, a Darkest Dungeon, or whatever. That is not a good enough answer anymore. And it's, I think, why we've seen these kinds of surprise hits that people weren't expecting, a Blueprints or a Balatro, or again, pick any game that blew up over the last 3 years to get that big. But the reason why they worked so well is because there weren't any games like that. That the game kind of touched on something that people didn't know they were needing, but guess what? A lot of people wanted to play that. And from my own perspective, someone who studies so much in terms of design, I don't feel like you can kind of force that to work. You can't, again, put 100 people into a room and say, make me something completely new and original, and it's going to come out in the next, 8 months. And for you, as kind of my final question, as someone who is just, starting out on this whole journey of doing game dev, when you're thinking about your games, as you said, going from making a game jam to maybe something that's more middle tier or middle size, what are you thinking about in terms of how do I want this game, or how do I want my next game to kind of fit within the market? Do you think about the market, or are you just right now in this state of, I just want to make something?
For the most part, it's it's the latter, pretty much. I don't really care much for the market. Yeah, maybe card games like Balatro are popular right now, and stuff like that. But I mean, for the stuff that I really want to release, they're kind of times being big in the market have ended long ago. Which as I said, it's a little too late to hope for it to be big, but I just want it to have something that I can say I made something. I'm not expecting it to go massive. Everybody's playing it. Streamers everywhere are streaming it, etc., etc. Millions of downloads. I'm gonna be a bajillionaire. I'm not expecting that. I'm more just expecting I have something. I made this. I didn't. It's my original idea. I worked on all this myself. And it's just something to put under my name,
And again, when you're starting, when you're learning to actually do this, that's fine. It's, again, for a lot of people, they think someone just, walks to their computer 2 years later, they have a dream game out, it's all done. It never works that way. And what we've seen time and time again is that these projects that do blow up, they're not the first game that these developers have made. They have probably worked on a a crazy number of failed prototypes, failed projects to get to the point where they can make that one game. And it's why we've seen so many developers who've been in this space for longer or for a long time talk about sustainability. That if you completely crash and burn after your first or second game, you will probably never get a chance to make that one game that truly resonates with people, or at least that one game that shows the extent of your skill set.
Yeah, and I like maybe eventually, like, if you don't manage, especially if you use your all of your effort on those first two games, you no longer have like the energy to make that third game anyway, even if you wanted to.
Yeah. And it's why we see a lot of developers tend to burn out in that respect, or even studios dying when they're not growing or they're not learning these lessons. Because if you think you can just keep throwing infinite money and infinite time at this stuff, more than not, it's never going to work out that way for you. I think with that, we can certainly wrap things up for today. I guess for you and for people listening, as we've said, you're still thinking about larger or medium scale projects. Have you started to work on anything, or are you currently working on something right now?
I'm currently, I mean, as I said, I'm currently more just iterating on some of my game jam games, just over time, just trying to improve them and add more content, especially to some of them that got more popular, quote unquote, as in they got they weren't completely under the radar, unnoticed by anybody. On my itch page, I got my top 2 games, I guess, in quality, because I just somehow did really well, in my opinion, on them, and people quite like them. So I just thought I might as well continue going, despite neither of them actually winning, but they both got pretty high on the rankings, and I feel like that's good enough for me. Just knowing that somebody liked it, and so if I keep iterating on it, maybe eventually people will like it more. And plus, I'm not just iterating on it in a vacuum. I'm letting people test it as I go and stuff like that, just to make sure where I'm headed with what I'm doing is a good thing, And
again, if you're still in school, you're still starting out, it's good to have this time to be able to experiment and mess with things, because it's better to do that now than again trying to base your entire livelihood on whether or not your game is going to work.
Yeah, it's because, especially now, I think now is probably the best time to start. For me, at least, where I am in life, because at this point, I don't have a full-time job I need to work on or focus on, and this isn't going to be I'm not preying on this being my livelihood or something. I'm just it's just a hobby, so I can just gauge how well I'm progressing in this, and if this might be a good place to continue going into the future,
Delta, thank you again for coming on and talking a little bit more about kind of being that first time development, because as I said, a lot of people will look at game dev only, from the the star, looking at it from the star's point of view, that I'm going to make the next super mega success, and they oftentimes struggle with being stuck in the reeds of game dev. And I hope that, best of luck with whatever you come up with next.
Yeah, thank you. And I may be back here again sometime in the future. So yeah.
All right, sounds good. So, with that said, everyone, thank you for tuning in to this cast. If you're new, do the YouTubing stuff, check out the Discord, the Patreon, buy all the many copies of my books. As I said at the beginning, if you are a developer working on a project or just want to talk about game dev, I'm always looking for guests for this series, so be sure to reach out. With that, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games. And until next time, take care.